Woman, don't bow down, no. Don't let them silence you. Feminist, manifest, like a supreme. You are great to the wherever you've been. Your vision is better than anything you've seen. Just anywhere, linear, suffered and been grieved. Woman, don't bow down. Don't let them silence you. Yes, girl.
Good evening and welcome to our show. We are forward, fearless, and unapologetically feminist, a space where we don't just want to rattle the cage of patriarchy, but rather aim to smash it. Tonight, we'll look at the different ways in which patriarchy shows up in our day-to-day lives.
All traditional cities have been built for men because of the traditional family structure.
And we also talk about toxic masculinity and how it harms men.
There's a crisis in manhood because they're trying to navigate their identity and trying to understand themselves, but also trying to navigate fighting the system that affects both themselves and women as well.
You can also join us in our conversation by reaching out to us on our social media pages as seen at the bottom of our screen. I'm not alone in this quest to dismantle the patriarchy. I am joined by my fierce feminist warrior sisters, Fina Kudisang, Niko Shukwambane, and Tando Kumete. How y'all doing?
Good. We want to do some dismantling.
Let's dismantle. We all agree that we want to dismantle patriarchy. But it might be helpful to first have a quick discussion about what patriarchy actually is.
I mean, well, quite simply put, it's a political, economic, and social system which privileges men at the expense of women, right? But it also insists that males are inherently dominant and superior, and it maintains that dominance through psychological terror. And violence.
It is a system, and any system, even a caste system, needs maintenance for it to keep functioning, right?
Right.
So that is why it's maintained through religion, through culture, entrenching that dominance that you speak about.
Personally, I believe that patriarchy came to be in our society through implanting white heteropatriarchy in our economy, our land, our legal systems, and in our socialization. And, you know, if you think of what white heteropatriarchy essentially is about, you know, discriminating against human beings on the basis of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their sex, their socioeconomic class, as well as their physical abilities. So there's definitely an intersection in how we experience patriarchy. You know, for Black women, for instance, there's a racialized form of patriarchy that we can't ignore.
You can't also discuss, you know, white heteropatriarchy without discussing misogynoia, right? Which stems from misogyny, which means, you know, the hatred of women, and noir, of course, implies to Blackness, right? So misogynoia then being the hatred of Black women.
So you don't just hate women, you hate Black women in particular.
Targeted.
Let's find the language for it, you know, that helps us to express it. And I like that Ponzo always gives us this language, you know. So Ponzo is here, she's going to tell us, you know, in different languages. It's in Tswana. I hope there's Zulu word for it that we can learn, so that even Zulu women, Tsonga women, different women can know that, okay, so what I'm experiencing is patriarchy, you know, and be able to express it in their language.
It's always good to be back.
Always good to have you here.
Yes.
So today, we patriarchy. Ka Setswana re bitsa
O itse ka Setswana Osfina, patriarchy ke mafoko a mantsintsi mme a botlhokwa gore ra bue. Ha re ka bua patriarchy ke tsamaiso kakaretso ya setšhaba e fang banna marapo le matla a go busa le go kgatla ka basadi.
But how has patriarchy manifested for you when
When I was about 12 or 13 years old, ga ke fologa skofo. Ke tswa sekolong ne ke tsena sekolo very far from go gae. Ga ke fologa skofo. Ne gona le ntate mong o na nna gaufi le go gae. Ke godisitswe ke gore o dumedisa motho o mo lo mo o motho. Ke mo dumedise ntate a ge pa le kae a ge ngwana ungolele ne. That was like he said that every single time.
Consistent.
Ungolele. And in the 12, 13-year-old body, ke gopola ke le very uncomfortable. Ke sa tlhaloganye man, ke tsitsibana mmele, ke sa tlhaloganye gore ntate o why a rialo o goreng ke se comfortable antare mafuko. And it only took me until I was in my early 20s to realize gore he was a predator. He wanted a way in. But because ne gona le this gut feeling mo mmeleng wa ka of gore fela ne ke sa tlwaela o itse re gotse ga o e ko malapeng a gona le malapa sa tsene ko. It was also patriarchy that told our parents that gore gona le dijarata tse dintso sa tseneng ko tsone. So that was the first incident ke gopolang gore patriarchy, or when I felt like a girl for the first time. Ke le munyane gore me being again boom back it can put me into danger.
I worry about the quite psychological violence of fear. Peter, ke feta ko back station. Ka surroundiwa ke a group with lebandla, and all of them touching me on different parts of my body. It felt to me like it took 5 minutes. It was probably more like 20 to 30 seconds, but it was the longest period of my life and then when they finished, they all burst out laughing. The humiliation of understanding at that age, I think I was 15, that any man around me can touch me without my permission, and that my body did not belong to me. And for example, if that could also end up kampama. You know, so literally, how we talk about navigate a space thing lemang, and so you're always careful because otaba go bitswa, otaba go bitiwa, and otaba banna.
So if you don't surrender to the violence, there's more violence.
Yes, potentially. So we're constantly living in fear.
And it's just to not care about something, you know. And it's literally that. I love this phrase because it's just so violent in its nature.
It's a great word, Thank you very much, Ponso. We'll speak to you next time. Later on, we delve deeper into the conversation about the ways in which public spaces in South Africa are unsafe for women. We are literally not even safe in the police station or the post office. But first, we must talk about how patriarchal norms have aggravated the devastating effects of the coronavirus pandemic on women's lives. That's up next.
Don't let them silence you. Don't let them silence you.
If you're just joining us, we have been discussing patriarchy, what it is, and some of the harmful ways in which it shows up in our day-to-day lives. We are keen to hear how you think patriarchy has manifested in your own life. You can let us know on our social media platforms.
I really want us to talk about public spaces. They are, by their very nature, shared spaces and should give us all the right to live, move around, and work with dignity and safety. But this is not the case for our public spaces here in South Africa. I think for many of us, the murder of Uyinene Mkhwetyana brought into sharp focus the ways in which women remain unsafe in our public spaces.
In 2017, if you remember, there was a rape culture happening, a trending rape culture where rape was happening in the taxis.
I remember.
You know, in front of children, violating women in a space where all they wanted was a resource to get to point B. Soul City decided at that time to do a campaign. We were calling it We the People Demand Safety.
And I remember this campaign. I was in university at the time. And I remember just feeling completely unsafe. There were women calling into radio stations, frightened, speaking about rape. And it was quite a novel thing at the time because women were never, ever that confident to come onto a public platform and speak about their violation. But at the time also, it was just after Karabo Mokoena was murdered as well. And so public space for me became something that made me completely anxious. Walking down the street, I would look over my shoulder. You know, that anxiety of that period, I remember it very, very well.
You know, as a result of that, we then partnered with an organization in India. And there's an app called Safety Pin. And I would encourage all of us to download it. How it works is that if you have the app, as you move, you know, in public spaces, you are able to sort of, it collects information around safety.
Oh, wow.
So you are able to put your information there and people are able to track, you know, whether you are en route where you were going, right? And track whether you've sort of off-ramped if you are in a taxi, and they are able to come and rescue you.
And in fact, that data is actually more accurate because you have people giving each other information about a particular environment and its safety. And I think a lot of the times the information and the data that we are privy to is not correctly like aggregated. You know? So I think this is a great opportunity to disaggregate data, but to also have live data of what's actually happening on the ground, so that when we implement various types of interventions, we know exactly what's happening at particular moments and periods in time.
Because I suppose the success of the safety pin, or rather the mechanism of it, depends on women being the ones to input that information about a particular place. So you're able to report dark alleys where like municipality lights are not working and they should be, and where there are issues around there. So that, and it's not hopaisa for the sake of hopaisa. It is hopaisa for the sake of changing. If a building manager or a building owner, as I've become, is told about and is reported on the safety pin for violation of various things, you know, you want to do something about it. It doesn't feel good to know that you are providing a space that's not safe for women.
10, 20 years back, hearing all kinds of phrases that would police us from public space, right? Like, walk with your keys between your knuckles, text a friend when you arrive home safely, don't drink too much, keep an eye on your drinks, be aware of your surroundings, right? Don't wear headphones, there's safety in numbers, don't go out after dark, don't dress too provocatively. But these are just some of the advices that women receive on a daily. To discuss this further, please welcome Senior Research Associate for the Center of Social Change, Dr. Vashna Jagarnath. Doctor, how does patriarchy dominate public space?
Well, patriarchy actually is a system that is in place throughout society. So it is dominant in public space, it's dominant in private space, it's just dominant in our life. When society has been developed over time, it's been developed in favor of patriarchy. Because patriarchy as a system is a system that's developed to favor men. All traditional cities have been built for men because of the traditional family structure. Women were meant to stay at home, men were meant to go to work. And if you look at that video, even those men who are working class, who don't have the means of productions in their hands, who don't own the city technically, they feel they own it. But the women are walking through that space very guardedly. Their body language is like, even if no one's touching them, is shying away from people. So you can see that even in the video. So absolutely, public spaces, city, your workspace, all of these spaces are deeply dominated by patriarchy.
Doctor, how does a lack of access to this safe public spaces that we're talking about impact on claiming the right to bodily integrity? As I was watching the video, it's so disturbing because it's like, you know, you don't have a right to your own body. In fact, or either that or other people, particularly men, have more of a right to your body, and even strange men. How does this all impact on us psychologically, on our claim to the right to bodily integrity?
The deep psychological damage that patriarchy does to you, to make you understand from a young age to know your space, how to sit, how to stand, how to dress. Don't show this, don't show that, don't eat this, don't speak too loudly. They even like, don't speak too loudly. Don't share your opinions, know where to stand, have respect, make your body smaller, make your whole self smaller. Within patriarchy, women's lives are limited. When they started talking about this 24 hours without men in the world, what would you do? on Twitter recently. And I remember thinking, I would go for a run at night. Right, you know, I'd go for a run at night alone. I'd be able to walk. I wouldn't have to check every window is locked. And mine went to public because I'm one of the few people who, right now in my life, is lucky enough to have a safe, intimate space. But then I thought about all those women who could then be at home and be safe.
Rather sad, isn't it, Doctor, that, you know, we find ourselves in a country that is treating women and queer bodies in this way. But whose responsibility is it then to create these spaces, these public spaces, that they are safe, inclusive and accessible? And how do we get to that solution? How do we get to a point where we create that space?
The responsibility has to be put onto the government, because we have tasked them to keep us safe, to run our country well, to make sure that we have rights, our full human rights, actually. So it's their task to make sure that is happening. And if they don't do it, then it's our task to begin to hold them accountable. And there are a variety of things that they can do to make sure this happens. And it starts at school. So, for example, if you have a school where boys are taught not to catcall, not to think that they have a right to your body if you are standing next to them. You know, if you begin to do that deep work on young men, then they won't grow up to do that. So it needs to start at the basis of education. And we as a society need to begin to hold men and the government and people who are powerful in society responsible. And this outrage that lasts only 5 minutes, and then we go back home and we forget about it because we then are more interested in other things, watching the Kardashians or something. Those are distractions. We need to do the hard work, and we need to do it every day. It's a task every day for women to map out how to do basic things in life, how to get food, how to get to work. If they have an abuser at home, how to live in their home with this abuser. So I think it's really, really a lot of work. And our society being so unequal, being highly racialized as well, and deeply, deeply divided by class, we have this issue, and we need to deal with it on all these levels. And we need to make sure that our state is dealing with it and properly. We don't need the president to come and give us some speech every now and then and tell us how bad he feels. We need him to actually make the changes. We need to make sure that there's street lighting, that there's safe spaces for people to go to, that as a young woman, if you go and report a rape case, you are not told to come back the next morning, for example, or made fun of, or mocked, or actually, in fact, attacked in that same station, police station that you went to report harassment. So I think those are some of the key things we have to begin to work on, and really with very much urgency.
Yeah, clearly we have our work cut out for us, right? Thank you for joining us, Dr. Jagannath, and for sharing your insights.
We would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment on any of our social media pages and tell us how you would create a safe space for women.
Don't let them silence you. Don't let them silence you.
Welcome back. Today we are talking about patriarchy and the different ways in which it shows up in everyday life. You know what another manifestation of patriarchy is with gender parity when it comes to pay. Equally at all. It is 2020 and we still do not have widespread pay parity because we live in a world that assumes that men are more intelligent and more hardworking than women. There seems to be an unwritten rule that men automatically have more responsibilities, and so it is justifiable for them to earn more. Can you believe that?
Yeah, and I think it reminds me of how Bafana and Banyana are being treated in this country, right? The rules of engagement are the same, so why should they be paid differently, right? But Brazil, I think, is setting a good example. They are now paying the soccer team, the women's soccer team, the same as what they pay for the male soccer team.
Halala, Brazil, halala.
And just on that point, the fact that, you know, certain sporting teams, you know, like local leagues and stuff, after the lockdown, the men were allowed to go back to work, to return to train, to play, and women weren't.
Yes, young Asula Lendawale, in fact, because umuntu usebenza in the same company, bayenza the exact same type of work, and yet the person is getting paid more. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
I can tell you, definitely in the entertainment world, as television presenters, as radio presenters in particular, that the parity there is non-existent. Men are assumed to be better, and therefore get paid more.
That's so hard. In fact, the statistics on the gender gap in work hours are unbelievable. So we've invited a scholar, ambassador, and feminist, Barbara Masiguela, to join us now to really unpack the patriarchal status quo in so far as gender pay gap is concerned.
So welcome, Mam Barbara Masiguela. It's a little odd for us to be sitting like this since we are friends outside of this studio, but welcome in any case. And today we're going to talk about pay parity in the home in particular. Why is it, though, that our society is still so hell-bent on not monetizing and therefore not valuing the work that women do at home?
Because it's designed by men. It's not designed by women. They've never, from traditional times to now, women have not designed statecraft type of work. It's men who have designed all of that.
Do you think it's possible for us to actually have paid care work in the home? Do you think maybe there's some kind of a legitimate structure that we can put into place to facilitate that?
I think that it would depend on unity of women, because I think that, especially in our country, we are faced not only with gender problems, but we are also faced with racially defined problems. Yes. It's about finding a way of engaging the women in Soweto, in Klipspruit, in Alexandra, as well as the women in the urban areas. And whatever we do in South Africa that we try to organize, there is always that apartheid spatial, the spatial apartheid which ensures that we cannot move together at the same time.
And just to go back to your point on unity and apartheid spatial justice, what I noticed in for instance, the fight against GBV in different spaces is that we couldn't, as women of different racial groupings, come together. When we were in Cape Town, you found that, you'd have a particular race of women who would be fighting against gangsterism and other forms of, social issues, and then other races fighting, instead of us actually coming together and forming one united front. And, I mean, imagine if we could have one united front of women fighting against domestic related issues, fighting for paid care work in the home.
And how do you organize women who are stay-at-home workers? Who work how do you go from house to house? It has to be done from a national legal, legislative
But what, remember, when too frustrating though, so Constitution of South Africa is considered hey, kiona e top mo lefatsheng when it comes to the issues sabasadi, and yet reality for example 2 million women lost their jobs over the complications around COVID-19, which means that when you consider that 60 to 70% of households are headed by women that were in a difficult space. So how is it that our reality as women is so different than what you and other people who negotiated on our behalf? Why the disparity?
Well, because you see, whatever it is, whether it's a political organization, whether you are in a negotiations commission, everything is designed by men. Even this thing, the template that you use is not a newly invented template. I mean, one of the things we did is that before we even negotiated, we went all over the world to find out about other constitutions and how they work. And those constitutions were designed by men, whether it's the English one or the American one or the German one, they are designed by men. So what I'm trying to say is that we have a fundamental problem And the fundamental problem is that we are trying to change things in an environment which has been designed for the privilege and advantage of men.
Yes.
And we are not dealing with the basics, you know. But that is our reality. So under the circumstances, then, we have to think, given that we had no choice in where we are, how do we then approach the problem? Do we approach it by demonizing men? I'm against demonizing men because I have 2 sons and I have nieces, I have nephews, I have grandsons, you know, I have all of that. I can't.
You can't.
I can't demonize men. Do we do it by holding on to our little positions? You have a little group in Area 8, I have a group in 12, somebody else has another little group. All of us are dealing with bits and pieces. Some are dealing with sexual stuff, some are dealing with domestic stuff, some are dealing with economy, with cooperation. So we really have to sit down and forget about the little positions that we have and find a unified manner in which we can address our problems, which manifest themselves in all spheres, including the political sphere.
Absolutely, without a doubt. We could have this conversation, quite frankly,
definitely.
for quite a while. Bambi, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your fascinating insights. Later, we're going to discuss toxic masculinity, butloli basinna, and how it is harmful to both women and men. Stay with us.
Don't let them silence you. Don't let them silence you.
From a young age, men are socialized into harmful and toxic notions of manhood, which we see play out in all corners of our society, even in our schools. Our roving reporter, Nsako Mhlanga, spoke to a few young people about their experiences.
So we're talking about a word that a lot of people struggle with, patriarchy, where we need to start having those conversations in our schools.
Why can we not just be equal? I think that's one thing that the patriarchy does. It makes it seem that men should be superior, when in fact I think the model that men should be is equal.
I remember distinctly asking a teacher why it is that we aren't allowed to have javelin as a sport, because my cousin played it, and they told us, no, it's a boys' sport. Javelin is a boys' sport. And for me that was just like, okay, but why is there this distinction? You know, why are we taught, okay, cool, this is your role, this is your place. From that young of an age, you don't even know what patriarchy is and you're experiencing it.
Definitely the high school setting is an environment where they set you up to be this model woman to serve for the patriarchy.
With the uniforms and everything around, like the certain length, the skirt had to be a certain length.
And you had to go on your knees.
Yes, measure it. And also just not being able to wear like tracksuit pants, just that restriction. I mean, at the time I didn't realize it, but then afterwards, after school, I was like, actually, that was quite problematic.
The high school I went to, it also being a Catholic high school, you know, so we could never challenge the men in our lives. We also always had to be modest. We always had to be respectful. And for me, it never made sense. I was just like, this can't be it. You can't sort of prime me to be just subservient.
I had this friend in high school, one of my very close friends. She broke her virginity, right? The mom found out that it was happening. The way they found out is like, so the guy would like took a selfie and then with her sleeping. And on top of that, there was a picture of the blood on the sheets, right? And what's crazy is that she dated him for 6 months after that. And that's where the problem is the fact that she saw nothing wrong with what had happened, with the pictures that were shared.
You can't just say, oh, the onus is on girls' schools to prepare girls for what is out there. We also need to be addressing our young men.
How do we have conversations like that?
When I teach young boys, I always tell them that patriarchy in particular, the subset of patriarchy being toxic masculinity, doesn't give you a lot of free will in deciding who you want to be. Because you're told that you should be like this, you should be dominant, assertive, aggressive, you should excel in all these things, but if you choose to want to cook, if you choose to want to do other feminine things, then you're considered weak. You see, what does that do to your self-esteem? Then you see depression happening, then you see suicide in men. So essentially there's a crisis in masculinity, there's a crisis in manhood, because they're trying to navigate their identity and trying to understand themselves, but also trying to navigate fighting the system that affects both themselves and women as well.
That there needs to be that open channel between the household and the schooling as well. So it mustn't be two separate entities. They need to be interlinked and they need to work together. Also just identifying the problems and also correcting them, because most times they are identified and then they're just hidden, and there's no way forward without correction.
By saying that, you know what, when I do have a girl child or if I do have a boy child, I'm giving them the equal set amount of responsibilities that are not gendered. The thing is, schools are microcosms of society. And so we have to make sure that we are sort of creating young children that know themselves rather than expecting to live up to what society wants them to be.
I'm laughing not because what they are saying is a joke, but I find it rather amazing that 20 years ago when I was a teenager, the same things could have been said, So you wonder, does it mean that we are not moving? We live in a society where things are not changing?
Listen, I was a teenager 40 years ago, okay? I'm the ancestor at this table. And that was still happening with us.
You know what, Shina Khomotsonyeko, I'm so happy that we're having this conversation. A lot of the socialization, a lot of toxic socialization, toxic masculinity and toxic femininity are taught to children at schools. And I think even the death this year of young children like Enoch Mpianzi is a very good example of us normalizing things like toxic initiations into manhood, things like ontgroening, which is the Afrikaans version of hazing and initiation of boy children especially.
And you talk about schools and what is happening there, but I worry also about it's happening at home. Before these kids go to school, because schools are not the only place where they socialize. The first place where we socialize our young men and women is in the household. By watching and imitating us as the parents, they're basically passing on the toxic masculinity. And we as women also sometimes pass on that toxic masculinity by enforcing different rules for the different genders.
And then it becomes a peer thing, right? It becomes a group thing where boys and girls of the same age then start grooming each other, in toxic masculinity.
Research has shown that young men are predominantly both the perpetrators as well as the victims of violence. And this has been directly linked to toxic masculinity. Now, what this tells us is that how masculinity is constructed currently puts not just women in danger, but men as well. Now, there is no better person to discuss this issue with than our mental health ally, Professor Kopano Ratele. It's time for Allie's Corner.
Welcome, Professor Kopano Ratele, and re lebogela motsotsonyana o re fang ona.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you just tell us briefly what toxic masculinity is and how that manifests in the daily lives of men?
There are certain things that men do, that we do, and that are supported by structures in history, such as that men have to be tough, have to be violent, have to not complain about pain. And this leads to what you have called and what has been called in popular literature, toxic masculinity, meaning problematic behaviors and ideas and beliefs about what it is to be a boy, and a boy then has to be strong, has to suppress pain and the rest of it.
Yeah.
Professor Kupano, yazi abantu abaningi bacanga ukuthi ene abafana bafundiswa toxic masculinity by amadoda in their lives, for instance, their uncles or their fathers. But as we know, in South Africa, it's abantu besimami kakhulu abakhulisa ingane endlini ekhaya. So my question then becomes, especially in those homes where boys are being raised by abo mama, where are they learning this toxic masculinity from?
In our country, over 60 to 70% of children are raised when they are raised by biological mothers. But sometimes, of course, we have to understand it's not just biological mothers. There are other women, adult women in the family, and maybe other men who are not biological fathers. So in these families, you yourself learn from what you read, what you see on television, what you hear your neighbors doing, from the church, from schools, that this is how boys are supposed to be. That boys are not supposed to do certain things, and they're supposed to do other things that we already mentioned. So you have what you might call then patriarchal women. And this is supported by research and theory, that women also can be patriarchal. And particularly, you could even have in a society where, although it is against women, patriarchy suppresses and oppresses women, even though it is against them, they still support it. They support it because this is what they know. Yeah. So particularly if you are a woman who's feminist, who is anti-patriarchal, or a man who's anti-patriarchal, you are in the minority. And so it becomes a lot harder to raise a boy or who's non-violent, to raise a girl who's feminist, and clearly because the hegemonic, meaning the dominant form of understanding gender, and particularly understanding men, is a patriarchal way of understanding that gender.
Prof, I have observed that men are actually afraid of one another. And when I read the research on the high levels of violence among men, I began to get the idea of where exactly that might be coming from. Would you say hore banna ba tshabana vele ne?
Well, this is partly true because the rates of homicide in South Africa show you that, well, at some point the numbers were, for every one woman killed in South Africa, there are about 5 to 6 men killed by other men, of course. So partly this would have grounds to exist, that men would be afraid of each other. But there's a big but right there. But because of the way we are, the way we're brought up, the way our society is structured, you are taught to suppress that fear. Yeah. A friend of mine said this a long time ago, a well-known person, I will not mention his name, but personally, if I'm walking at night, right now, in my age, and I see a group of men walking towards me, I cross the road because particularly when men are in groups, the likelihood of violence in my country is rather high. So there is some fear, unless, of course, you are trained, you are nurtured, which is a bad word to use right now. You are socialized into suppressing the fear.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights with us, Dr. Radele.
You're welcome.
Men of South Africa, I would like you to please indulge me by taking a deep moment to think. Think about how toxic masculinity has shaped your life. How do you feel it has harmed you? Please share your reflections with us on our social media platforms.
Don't let them silence you. Don't let them silence you.
Welcome back. We have been discussing the social system known as patriarchy and looking at the devastating impact that it has on our lives. We also explored toxic masculinity and the ways in which it does not only harm women, but it affects men as well. And any system that assigns power and privilege to one group at the expense of others is immoral and dehumanizing for all of us, quite frankly. And this is why dismantling patriarchy should be an urgent mission for all of us. But come to think of it, what would, healthy and progressive masculinities actually look like?
The first thing is that we need to understand that masculinity is not about men. A man can be feminine and a woman can be masculine. So the problem that we've had in our society is that we've taken this binary to say, if you are male, you are a man, you are masculine. And the second thing is that it's not necessarily masculinity that's an issue, because I consider myself a very masculine woman. The issue is toxicity. It's that word that precedes masculinity. Toxicity is about creating unfair biases and privileges because of how you look, because of your behavior, and because of the historical context that we've been discussing in the show already. And so for me, any healthy masculinity is the one that is devoid of toxicity.
So are you a healthy masculine, Tanda?
Oh, yeah.
Because by the same logic, it doesn't mean ka gore motho wa mosadi o motho o siameng. Yeah.
But if you understood what you are saying, it will liberate men. They can freely cry if they feel like doing it.
La baby, la man.
Lena, I like soft masculinity.
But there's something so vulnerable and so refreshing about a man who can cry in front of you. You know, like, nna ke feel okare wetsi ya no motho wan trusta, motho wan rata, and therefore they're able to be vulnerable with me. So I keep minding it also. Slide into the DMs, babe. Slide into them DMs. Parting shots?
So, you know, I think that queer people and people living with disabilities are probably the most vulnerable people to patriarchy. And I mean, our society is constantly evolving and developing. And what we need to do is that we need to recognize and respect that our sexual identities and our gender identities are not binary. We also need to respect that our abilities are not the same and that we exist on a spectrum of abilities. It is unacceptable for our public toilets to have free condoms, even in women's bathrooms, but not have free sanitary pads and not have dental dams and femidoms and finger doms to enable healthy queer sex or to enable women to take control of their sexual experiences. So as we move on and as we develop, let's remember that we don't just exist as one universal type of human being.
Yeah, on the subject matter of toilets, we know one example for me of patriarchy, if people still don't know what we are talking about, you know, is the smell of urine in public. You know, the smell of male urine, the stench, the perfume of patriarchy, I call it, you know? And the idea that it's one gender, right, that has so much access to public space that they can relieve themselves in public. You know, and for ourselves as women, you know, we don't have enough public toilets. They just aren't there. We have to hide. And we have to carry ourselves all the way home before we can relieve ourselves. And that is just my final thought there.
For me, I think we need political will. You know, we need reform in policies, we need reform in the curriculum that we teach in the schools, you know, for boys and girls to learn of feminism, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, all these things from a young age to understand. We spoke about how the home can also be problematic, right? So we need to make sure that spaces are created where we teach, where we are in dialogue, constant dialogue, to change, because there's a lot of unlearning that we need to do.
Habits are learned, which means that they can be unlearned. It is impossible to not feel and enjoy privilege because it feels good, but it is always at somebody else's expense. Why are we even having this conversation? Because the truth is that the average South African man enjoys every single privilege over Black women that patriarchy affords them. And not only can you get away with it, you're kind of expected to. The war on women is real. If you're not a part of the solution, you might just be a part of the problem. Here's what we have coming for you next week.
Ayanda sana la. Siyakwamkela kulisapho lwethu. Ungowethu ngoku. Ususala namhlanje ke siza kunika igama elitsha ozawubizwa ngalo. Igama lakho elitsha izaba ngoRudzani. Rudzani ngwananga, achitata khani. Na mirado ya hoyu muta. Ndikoria si boardroom hapa mwananga. Ndiatenda uri ompfa. Gare atla go tshameka fa. E se khale re solofetse le sia le lentse le taboga ka maotunyana fa. Kana bana ke le ruo la legae. Ke solofela ga ke utlwagetse.
Thank you so much for joining us. Until next week, we are here.